Boker Tov. Today's Daf Yomi is Bava Basra 143, Bava Basra Kuf Mem Gimel, and we're going to start the Daf at the top of 143a, Kuf Mem Gimel, 3 lines from the top. The Gemara discussed the case where a person says to a man and a donkey, he says to the man, At v'chamor. He says, I want you and the donkey to acquire this, meaning to say, he says to a person, I want you to acquire it, and the donkey. Now, obviously, a donkey can't acquire it. I say obviously, even though nowadays they can leave money in estates to animals. But here we say, the person says, you and the donkey, so we have a three-way dispute. What's the ruling? Rav Nachman Amar Kana Meltzer. Rav Nachman says, person acquires half under these circumstances. Rav Hamnuna Amar Kulam. Rav Hamnuna says, well, under these cases, he has not acquired anything. And Rav Sheshes Amar Kana Hakol. Rav Sheshes says, under these circumstances, he's acquired everything. So again, Rav Nachman says he acquires half. Rav Hamnuna says he has said nothing because the donkey can't acquire anything. And Rav Sheshes says the man who he says it to acquires everything. And Amar Rav Sheshes, Rav Sheshes says, I'll prove it to you. How can I prove to you that if you say these circumstances, you and the donkey, that the person you give it to acquires everything? We learn it from a brayso that Tanya Rabbi Yossi Omer El Chamar B'Kishus El Pnimi Shebo. So this relates to a person has to take truma. Truma is generally speaking 1/50th. That's the Beinoni. That's what the Gemara says, that B'Diaraisa, biblically speaking, even one kernel exempts the whole bushel. But rabbinically speaking, you should either give 1/40th, 1/50th, or 1/60th. So you take, in this case, you've tithed one cucumber out of 50 or one melon out of 50, but that's not enough because there's a bitter part in the inner part of the cucumber, which is bitter. And so you're not allowed to take from the bad on the good. So perhaps you have a little bit more bitterness that's relating in that one cucumber than to the other 49 cucumbers. So that's the scenario. So Rabbi Yossi says, you have the inner part, which is potentially bitter. So when you tithe it, you have to tithe on the inner part. You have to add on to the external part and then tithe it. So the Gemara asked the question, good morning, Harold. Gemara asked the question, why is this a case where the tithe takes effect? When you're tithe, aren't you in effect saying, I'm transferring the cucumbers, the other 49, to you, to this one cucumber, which is both sweet and bitter. And since the bitter can't take a tithe on the sweet, isn't that exactly the same case of at v'chamor? So we're on 143a, Harold, around 10 lines from the top. So the Gemara says, no, Shani Has, in that case, is different because actually from a biblical level, the Mediraisa, Truma Mal Yasahi. That biblically speaking, if you take a tithe from bad product onto good product, it actually works. Bilai said, how do we know that if you take a tithe from the bad product on the good product, it's actually a valid tithe, but you've done a sin? As it says, you're not allowed to do that because if you do it, you'll have a sin. But if it's not a valid tithe, then you actually haven't done it, technically violated the law. So why does it say you're carrying a sin? So we see from here that if you take a tithe from the bad on the good, it's technically speaking, biblically speaking, a valid truma. So that's why it works in this case. So you can't ask the question from you and a donkey. Just to review, just summarize where we are. A person goes to another person and says, I want you and this donkey to acquire this object. Now a donkey can't acquire anything. So then the question becomes, what is the meaning of this phrase where he says, you and this donkey? So we have three positions. The position of Rav Nachman is that the man acquires half, and the other half is not given over to the donkey. The second position is, since part of the statement is wrong, then the whole statement is ignored, and the man acquires nothing. Rav Shesha says the man gets everything. Gemara tried to bring a source for Rav Sheshes from this case of the tithing of the bad part of the cucumber with the good part, and we rejected that source. So now the Gemara says, Amar Rav Mordechai or Rav Ashi, Masiv Rav Avia Tiyuftis. Rav Mordechai says to Rav Ashi, Rav Avia raised a refutation from the following case. Basically, what was the case? There were 5 women. Amongst these 5 women were 2 sisters. This is the Mishnah in Kedushin. So one guy comes along and collects a basket of figs. So it was their basket. The Gemara in Kedushin tells us why that's relevant. And it was now ownerless because it's sabbatical year. So he takes this basket and he says, he says, I'm betrothing all of you. Now, of course, he can't betroth all of them because you're not allowed to betroth 2 sisters. And so therefore, what does he do under this circumstance? He says, I'm betrothing all of you. And then one of the women accepts it on behalf of all the others. And he says the sisters are not betrothed. But doesn't that prove the sisters are not betrothed, but the others are betrothed? So, but the other sisters are betrothed. Isn't this exactly the same case of you and the donkey? Because he can only betroth some of the women there and not all of them. And yet we still say that it's valid. So this is a question on Rav Sheshes, and it's also a question on Rav Hamnuna, because it really seems to be like what Rav Nachman is saying, that you've just acquired the ones you could acquire. You just betrothed the ones you could acquire. So the Gemara says, actually, the way I just explained it was not in accordance with the Rashbam. Rashbam says the question on Rav Nachman and Rav Hamnuna, because they say you've acquired, they say you don't, they say you've acquired everything, but the Machokas were showing them who exactly this is a question on. But anyway, the Gemara says that Amrulay, that Rav Ashi responds to Rav Mordechai, he responds, Hainu dechazi Ravuna bar Avia b'chalma. This is why Rav Huna, the son of Rav Avia, the son of the one who asked the questions, he saw in a dream the most of Rav Avia tiyufta, that Rav Avia asked this question, and and the answer that was given is, he said, he said, no, what the man said was, whoever amongst you is worthy to be betrothed to me should be betrothed to me. So he clearly excluded the sisters from the scenario, and that's why it works. Related case, where relates to half a transaction. Somebody says to his wife this ambiguous phrase. Says to his wife, says, I'm giving you my assets and to your children or our children. He says, I'm giving you and my children my assets. So the question is he intending to give his wife one share like each of the children, or is he intending his wife to give half and the children the other half? So Rabbi Yosef Kanta Mechza. So he said, Rabbi Yosef says she's acquired half, but the intent is that she's going to split it with the children, and she gets half and they get half. Rabbi Yosef Minami. How do I know this? The Tanya, Rabbi Omer, it says in the Brisa, Rabbi says, Vayso Aaron Avanav. And about the lechem apanim, the bread of the table, it says it should be for Aaron and his children. And the Brisa says, Melzo Aaron, Melzo Vanav. Half to Aaron and half to his children. So this supports the idea when you say to you and to the others, and the others are the plural, that each side gets half. So the Gemara says, Amrullah Abaye challenges his Rebbe Rav Yosef. He says, Bishla Mahasam Aaron Bar Chaluku. In that case, it's different. Aaron was already getting some of the bread, and now by singling him out, he's moving up one level from one share to half. But Lahachi Parat Beirachmano a Mishkal Palga. That's why the Torah singles him out to say he's going to get half. But a woman, La Basirushi, the woman, if the husband hadn't said, I'm giving this to you, she wouldn't get nothing. So therefore, by singling her out, he's just giving her one portion. She should really just get like one of the sons. So there's a dispute. Rav Yosef, she'll get half. Abai says she just gets one share. Aini, is it really the case? The Gemara challenges Abaye. What about the fact that Shmuel was in Tiberias and he gave to the widow in this circumstance half, and there was this in Ardai and Shmuel gave him half, and Bitferia, it happened in Tiberias, Rabbi Yochanan Palga, Rabbi Yochanan gave her half. Visu, and furthermore, there was a crown tax. They used to place a tax because you had the great privilege of living in this kingdom, so they put a tax on your head. The Shadubei Malka, Abule Vastruki. The king levied the tax on the nobleman. The Abule is the wealthy people, and Astruge is not 100% clear what that means, but most translated as like the nobleman. And he said, I'm placing this tax on the wealthy and the noblemen. Then there were more noblemen than wealthy. And I'm a Rebbe, Nisvu Abue Palga, Istruge Palga. And Rebbe said, each one should give half, like Rabbi Yosef said it. So we see from here, it's like Rabbi Yosef. Where it says, the two cases totally different. There, from the beginning, the king said, I'm taxing the wealthy. For the beginning was the wealthy. And then these noblemen decide to help out the wealthy people. But then the king was aware that they were helping. And now when he says on the wealthy and the noblemen, he says it's to give half because the noblemen were already giving something. So by writing them down, he's raising their level, like by Aaron, raising it from one share to a half. So Masav Rabbi Zera, Rabbi Zera says from the following, he challenges Rabbi Yosef's position that anytime you have a division, you do it into two halves. From the following case, that is somebody who takes upon himself to bring a grain offering. Somebody says, I'm going to give a grain offering. And he says, I'm going to give a grain offering of Mea Isaron, of 100 Isaron. Now, the size of a grain offering is limited to 60 Isaron for each utensil, because otherwise you can't mix the oil properly. So he says, I'm giving 100 Isaron, and to bring it into two utensils. So you would think, how would you bring it? You would think it would be 50-50. So, but what does he do instead? Maybe Shisha Mekliyachad, Varba Mekliyachad, he brings 60 in one and 40 in the other, on the top of 143b. There may be Chamisha Mekliyachad, V'chamisha Mekliyacher, and if he brings 50 in one and 50 in the other, Yatza, it's okay. So we see from here, that if he brought it that way, it's okay, but ideally he should bring 60-40, and this is a question on Rav. This is the question on Rav Yosef. The Gemara says, if you say it's always, whenever you make a division, it's 50-50, even at the outset, you should give you should say 50-50, not 60-40. Gemara right away rejects this. Gemara says, you think the two cases are the same? Hasam, there in the case of the grain offering, and we know from the language he uses, I want to give a grain offering of 100 isaron. We know from the outset that he intends to bring a huge offering. Right? And the only reason why he says two utensils is the other to go after he knows it's impossible to bring it in one utensil because the maximum size is 60. So therefore, we understand the intent of what he's saying is the biggest one I can bring, I'll bring. And so therefore, it's 60 and then 40. And how do we rule in this case? The law is like Rav Yosef when he argues with Rabbah in the Babas. The law is like him in three cases. Besada and Yeremechza. Respect to a Sada field, which he had way back at the very beginning, and one in 12b, where Rav Yosef talks about a case where a man bought a field next to his father's field, and then his father died, and he says, I want this field because it's closest to my father's field. And then we have, that was the dispute with Rabbah, and also the idea of at what point you can no longer go back on your agreement with somebody. So if you make an agreement with somebody, at what point can you no longer go back? And Rav Yosef says, as long as you're still engaged in that manner, umechza, Mechza is this idea that when you split something, it's 50-50. So in all these cases, the law is like Rav Yosef in these three cases. Then the Gemara has some more ambiguous language. A guy sends some pieces of silk clothing to his household, and Amar Rabbi Yamis or Rabbi Yamis, he doesn't specify who it is. He sends it, he's away overseas, whatever. Sends it to his household, and his sons and daughters are there, his sons-in-law and his daughters-in-law. Everybody says it's for me. So who gets it? So says Rabbi Ami, if it's clothing that's appropriate for boys, the boys get it. If it's appropriate for girls, the girls get it. Below Amran it's like Hawasa. When do we say that if it's for girls, the girls get it? When there's no daughters-in-law in the house. Like Hawasa, Shadar. But if he has a daughter-in-law in the house, then the assumption is he sent it for his daughter-in-law. Because why? Because a person will honor his daughter-in-law out of the love for his son. So, and that was their custom that the daughters-in-law, Ravan says, Rav Elazar ben Nassan, the German Tosafist or the German Rishon, he writes that one of the earliest of the Rishonim in Germany. He writes that their custom was that the daughters, when they got married, they would stay in the home of their husband. And so therefore, he for sure sent it to his daughter-in-law who's living in the house, and not to his own married daughters who are living in their husband's homes. Okay, fine. But Banase, well, Nesibim, but if he had in the home daughters who were not married, he would send it to his daughter and not to his daughter-in-law. Ahuda Amar, next case, Ahuda Amar Nechasai Levanai. He says, I'm giving my assets to my Banai. This is more ambiguous in Hebrew than in English. Banai could mean my sons, it could mean my children. So what does it mean here? Havaway Brau Barta, you had a son and a daughter. Mikaro Inchi Lebra Banai. Do you call your son in the singular? You call your one son in the plural Banai. And therefore, what he's saying is, I am giving everything to my son and not to my daughter. Odoma Lokaro Inchi Lebra Banai. Maybe you don't call your son your sons. Umoshlo Lavarta B'matana. And what he intends is to give it to his daughter also. Abai Tashma. So let's try and bring a proof. Abai says, it says, Ubnei Dan Chushim. The sons of Dan were Chushim. So we see from here, even though it refers to the sons of Dan in the plural, nevertheless, there's only one son, Chushim. So we see from here, even though it's sons, it's still going to be referred to in the plural. So Amarle Rava rejects it as a proof. Dilma Kedutanit Bechizkiya Shayir Merubin Kechushim Shalkana. Maybe Kechushim wasn't his name, but the children of Dan were going to be numerous, like the bundle of reeds. Kechushim Shalkana, like a bundle of reeds. That's all it means. I heard from Rabbi Razner Shir, he says that Rav Pam cited the power of Dan as an example, that Binyamin had 10 sons, but he became the smallest tribe, whereas Dan had only one child, and then he became one of the largest tribes in the next generation. So you see from here that Hashem's ways, we don't know. We can't assume we know Hashem's ways. Also, Balchush, that there's a very beautiful sicha from Reb Chaim Shmulevitz. Reb Chaim Shmulevitz talks about his Chush was deaf, and so the Midrash says that when it came time to bury Yaakov and Marsa Machpelah, all of a sudden Esav appeared and he said, "I'm entitled to this," and they said, "No, your father, no, Esav, you sold it to our father." He says, "Prove it to me," and they said, "Oh, well, the deed is back in Egypt," so they had to stop and send somebody to Egypt. Meanwhile, the funeral was being upheld, so Chush said, "What's going on?" So they motioned to Chush that Esav's demanding proof, the real estate proof. So Chush comes along and knocks off Esav's head and kills him right away. And and Esav said is buried in Maras Machpelah. So the Rav Chaim Shmuel Levitt says, why is Chush the only one who did that? Everybody else was there. Why was Chush the only one outraged? So Rav Chaim Shmuel Levitt says, everybody else was part of the conversation. So the conversation was ongoing. And so as a consequence, they weren't just outraged when it went to the next level. But Chush didn't know what was going on. He was deaf. And all of a sudden he hears this extreme situation that his grandfather is not being allowed to be buried because of some tricks of his grandfather's brother, and he's completely outraged. But for other people, the outrage was less because they were used to it. And so that's what Rav Chaim Shmuel Levitt says. Anyway, Amrle, so Rava says, Rava ubenei Palu Eliav. It says in the pasuk of Midbar, the sons of Palu were Eliav. And another verse, this one from Divrei Yamim, Rav Yosef Amar Uvnei Eitan Azariah. So even though it says Bnei, it could refer to one person. Another case, a person said Nechasai lebanai. He says my assets will go to Banai, and this is in the plural. So what does this mean? Avale bra ubarbara. He had a son and a grandson. So the question is, Karo inche ubarbara bra olo. Do you call your grandson your son or not? So Rav Chaviva Amar Karo inche ubarbara bra. He says you do call your grandson your son, but Rav Ash, he says lo Karo inche ubarbara bra. He says you don't call your grandson your son. And Tanya Kavasi Rav Ashi. And we have a brayse that supports the fact that you don't call your grandson your son, because the brayse says if you say I'm not going to get any benefit from my son, you can get benefit from your grandson. But this is not a universal concept, because we know in some areas you do call your grandson your son. The Gemara in Yevamos talks about if a person, Rahman al his children are no longer alive, but his grandchildren are, and his grandchildren are like his children with respect to fulfilling the mitzvah of Puravu. Now we're up to the next Mishnah. It says the Mishnah, let's say a man leaves behind adult children and minor children, and and the children, they go into this state, and the adults invest and they improve the property. So do they have to split their improvements with their younger children, with the minors? So the Gemara says if they just did it without asking, they split that. But but if they say, if they're explicit about it in advance, they say, look, this is what my father left us. We're going to do this and consume it, and we're going to do this. I mean, they're explicit that they're doing it for themselves, and then they've done it for themselves. Also, a woman who increases her assets of the estate, if she's not explicit about it, they split it. But if she says, she says in advance, look what my husband left me, I'm going to do this and consume it, then then we're going to say that she splits, that she then increases it for herself. So you have to be explicit. So the Gemara says, Amar Rav Chavivi, Berei de Rav Yosef, Berei de Rava, Mishmei de Rava, Lo Shanu Ela Sheshabchu Nechasim, Machmas Nechasim. They say this idea that if the adults improve the assets, that they have to split it with everybody. That's only if they improve the assets because through the assets of their father, meaning to say that they hired workers from their father's assets in order to improve the other assets. Meaning, say they took the estate's money to improve the estate. But if they did their own investment, not the estate's investment, then then they get the profit. The Gemara says this is really the case. Even if their father only left them a pit with its cover that you hire the men out to, that people rent out in order to irrigate their fields with, and the brothers rented that out, they have to split it. And this well and its cover, that's like their own money, because since the brothers need to stand there and watch it to make sure that they are not going, that the people will not take too much water, or that nobody who hasn't paid will take. So it's like uh, their own assets. And nevertheless, we say that they have to split the improvements. Gemara says no. Shani Odaini, no, the case of the well is different. Obviously, they split the money that comes in from there because because everything he's doing is just basically a security guard. Even though the little kids could do it, it's just the presence there. So it's not like he was really bringing any added value, because the little kids would have been very happy to do it. Okay, we'll stop the recording here. Let's say to everybody,